Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about a question that I'm getting a lot in my comments, which is should you invest in the Palantir SPACs, the individual companies that they've invested in and their equities on the markets, or should you just allocate that money towards Palantir? This is a question I've been getting a lot. I wanted to make a video on it and I wanted to give my thought process because I've been kind of repeating my thought process every time I respond to someone in the comments. So I'd rather just share this video to kind of give it all fleshed out and have people be able to consume it when they're thinking about this question. Now, I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not an investment advisor. This is my logic and rationale behind how I think of the Palantir SPAC investment strategy and where you should allocate and where I personally would allocate my dollars if I was in this conundrum of should I invest in the SPAC investments or should I invest in Palantir? Now, let me say my answer, then I'm going to go back a little bit to explain what the SPAC investment thesis is, and then we're going to talk about how I walk within my rationale. My answer is no. If I had more additional capital, I would not invest it in a Palantir SPAC investment. I would rather invest it in Palantir, the company itself, because my thesis is that investing in Palantir, given the SPAC strategy that they have laid out, is basically like investing in a really risky ETF. It's like, or an index fund, like a really risky ETF index fund. An ETF and index fund is basically, so that you think of the S&P 500, they have the biggest 500 companies in the world, and they have small chunks of the shares of those biggest 500 companies in the S&P 500, which is why if you look at a graph of the S&P 500, every time it dips, every time there's a recession, every time things go down, it always comes back up, right? Because you're basically betting on the US economy prevailing, and the US economy has always prevailed no matter how bad it gets. And if it gets really bad, you just buy the dip, and while it gets back to normal, you've probably made some of your money even though you were down initially when you may have bought at the top. So betting on the S&P 500 is not the worst thing in the world, but the returns on the S&P 500 or on any index ETF will likely be less than what we want out of returns or what we're conditioned to as of returns when it comes to the more speculative high growth tech companies. So like, for example, if you put all the money you put into the S&P 500 in 2015, let's say $100,000 versus like Amazon, you're probably not going to make that much money because the S&P returns on average 7, 8, 9%. I know last year we had 27%, a little bit of an anomaly, but it's around 8 to 9% on average. Whereas Amazon returned a lot of money if you got it in 2015, given the run up that they've had, or something like a Tesla, right? You don't get Tesla-like level returns, 100Xs or 10Xs, even 20Xs in something like the S&P 500, which means it is a way to hedge your investments by taking a lot of money, investing in a really big ETF that contains a lot of chunks of companies so that if one day Apple goes down, but Tesla is up and the S&P 500 has a little bit of Apple, a little bit of Tesla, it balances out. So when an index that covers a lot of companies drops heavily, that means the entire market is falling really badly. But if it drops a little bit, that means there's some companies that are doing bad, some companies that are doing good, ultimately it balances out. It reduces the risk exposure you have to the downside when you invest in an ETF. I believe that investing in Palantir is basically like investing in a super risky ETF, which gives you exposure to all the SPAC investments they've made because all of those SPAC investments are part of Palantir's balance sheet, right? They've put legitimate money into these companies. They are equity holders of the shares of these companies. But by getting exposure to all those companies, if some of these companies do good or some of these companies do bad, your reward on the companies that do really good is not going to be as well as if you just bet on those companies in and of themselves, on those SPAC investments. But your risk is also going to be very limited, right? And if they do good, it only benefits Palantir, which is a good thing. And you get that exposure to the SPAC that did good. And if it does bad, it hurts Palantir, but it doesn't hurt the core business of Palantir. Like Palantir as a company will stay intact even if these SPAC investments don't do perfectly. So I'll explain a little bit more on my thesis for why I choose to allocate money to Palantir versus the SPAC investments. But I want to talk a little bit now about what the SPAC thesis is. And the reason it's important to understand the SPAC thesis is because although I said investing in Palantir is like investing in an index fund, it's one of the most riskiest index funds, right? Because when you're investing in the S&P 500, you have legitimate companies that are part of this global ETF or American ETF, which is why it's not as likely for you to necessarily lose a lot of money there because those companies are probably going to prevail, right? All 500 of those companies are not going to go to crap. They're not going to all be bankrupt. And if they are very close to it, the federal government's probably going to get involved and make sure they help these companies. That's kind of just how this thing works when you're a very big public company. But with Palantir, it's a risky ETF because a lot of these SPAC investments could all go to crap. I mean, there is just not a level of analysis or a level of size to these companies or a level of like value to these companies, like the same level of companies that are in other ETFs, which is why if they do bad, then it could be bad for Palantir, right? Which is why it's a very risky ETF. So why do they do the SPAC investments strategy in the first place? The core understanding of the SPAC investments is to understand the ability for Palantir to allocate capital in companies that have the potential to be data-driven decision makers that are pioneers within their industry. So, for example, Wejo is one of the most biggest SPAC investments that Palantir has made, not from a monetary perspective, but from a publicity perspective. Wejo is one of my favorites because Wejo does connected vehicle data. And because they do connected vehicle data and electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles are taking over, there are so many different use cases that Wejo's data and their service is going to have to a lot of different car manufacturers, OEMs, car companies, etc. Palantir has even introduced product offerings in conjunction with Wejo. So it's one of those SPAC investments that is working phenomenally right now for Palantir, not because Wejo's a big successful company, but because the growth trajectory of a connected vehicle data company in the EV space seems to be like it's going to be very big, right? There is a lot of potential there, even though we don't know if Wejo is going to succeed. That seems like a SPAC investment that is really meaningful, right? That seems like a SPAC investment in which you want to be a part of. Now, there are other companies as well, like Cellularity. That's a biotechnology company that does placenta-based, cell-based therapy to make sure that to try to solve degenerative diseases. There's Adherent, which is a digital advertising technology company that uses the highest forms of data to make sure digital advertising is more optimized than ever before. So there's a lot of these bets that Palantir has made on these companies that within their industry are trying to become the leaders of how they leverage and utilize big data at scale. And that's why the SPAC strategy is the SPAC strategy. Other companies use excess capital that they have and they invest it through like venture capital and they put it into these other companies. And it's like Google, for example, is Google Ventures. So Google Ventures is a arm of Google that makes certain investments in certain startups that they think are going to be really good. And eventually those startups either get big and Google gets value or Google ends up buying out those startups. Palantir took a little bit of a different approach. The approach is kind of the same in terms of taking excess capital and taking these small little bets on these companies, but they took very specific bets on companies that they believe are going to be able to use data in a way that isn't being used in their industry. So with Cellularity, not many biotechnology companies are using Foundry and using data-driven research methods to drive their R&D. And when you talk about placenta-based cell theory, there is a lot of R&D that needs to go into understanding how can we use placentas to be able to have better stem cell-based therapies on those placentas. And there's tons of R&D that can go into it if you're analyzing and synthesizing data at scale. It leads to the probability of a biotechnology company like Cellularity to not go to crap, which a lot of biotechnology companies do, because the competitive advantage is that they not only have data, but they're actually utilizing data in a world in which a lot of biotechnology companies necessarily don't do it the way that Palantir thinks they can do it, right? So there is a ton of value proposition towards investing in companies that likely are going to fail if we think about it generally, but are also likely not going to fail if they're using an approach that is so differentiated and competitive and gives them such a competitive advantage than their competitors in their particular industry. Additionally, Palantir gets two things working on these companies. They get to be able to take a bet, which means they get to be able to have an equity stake within these companies. So if Wejo goes to the moon, Palantir is going to have exposure to that, and Palantir is going to be able to get the benefits of their shares appreciating because Palantir owns a significant amount of shares in Wejo as a result of making that SPAC investment. But number two, Palantir gets a client. All of these SPAC investments are utilizing Palantir Foundry. I mean, Wejo's entire connected vehicle data platform is built on top of Foundry. And there's a lot of other of these SPAC investments that are building their data analytics softwares on top of Palantir Foundry. Sarcos Robotics is another one I covered before that makes these like real life robotic suits for industrial workers. They're building their entire software that powers their hardware on top of Foundry. So Palantir is getting an equity stake. Palantir is also getting revenue from these SPACs. Now that this revenue is probably negotiated in a really friendly way, but nonetheless, if these SPACs get bigger, these public companies start to get bigger, they're going to have more money to be able to allocate to this software. Palantir is going to be able to raise their prices because it's a very sticky business model. So like you get a client and a partner. You can introduce new product offerings like they did with Wejo. You get equity stakes in which if their shares appreciate, your exposure to them also appreciates as well. And then you get an actual client. The fourth thing is they get exposure to these industries in which other clients within the industry, within the biotech world, within the robotics world, can then know that, oh, Sarcos Robotics is using Palantir. Maybe we should get Palantir a call. Or, hey, Cellularity is getting really good with their R&D because of using Palantir Foundry. Maybe we should use them. Or, hey, Wejo is creating really amazing connected vehicle data on top of Foundry. Maybe we can do something with our data on top. Like, there is such strong exposure by having sticky little fingers all over these companies that are actually doing well in industries that it makes other industry leaders then decide that maybe they should give Palantir a look. So I think there's a multiplicity of benefits of this SPAC investment strategy, even if some of the SPACs go to crap, even if they don't succeed, which I fully expect some of them just won't work out of the 14. I don't think it's going to be 14 for 14, just going to the moon. But I do think if you get 3 or 4 of them, or even 1 or 2 of them that become really big, and not only makes up for the losses that you had on the other ones, but it actually allows Palantir to be able to show that their software was responsible for a company that was at its earliest stage, being a very early public company, now becoming a very mature company 5-6 years from now, and building their entire operations on top of Palantir. I think that's a major value proposition. So that's the SPAC investment strategy, and that's why it's so important. The problem is it's a risky strategy because a lot of these companies, as I said, may not do well, which is why when people ask me like, hey, are you putting money into like Wejo or Black Sky? Black Sky is literally like Google Earth on steroids. Like, it's using geospatial intelligence around their photos, and it's bringing all this data back to these clients. It's like using IoT on satellites. It's amazing, amazing stuff. I think Black Sky is like $2-3 a share or something. And obviously, these are high growth tech stocks that have also been hammered by the macro level economics that are happening right now. So a lot of people are like, hey, Wejo's at $4. It looks like a steal. They just partnered with Microsoft. Like, Black Sky looks like a steal. Should we invest in these companies? And again, my whole thesis is you have to have a lot of analysis and due diligence on these SPAC investments to be able to be comfortable to make these investments. Like, unless you know the level of analysis and details that you know on something like Palantir, on a Wejo or on an Aptirent or on a Cellularity or on a Sarcos Robotics, I personally wouldn't feel comfortable making that investment. But that's kind of my philosophy on making any investment, right? The level of analysis and deep dives I've done on Palantir is the same type of analysis and deep dives I want to do on any investment I make in order for me to sleep well at night, knowing whether the stock price goes up or down, because I have that much conviction that I'm in it for the long haul. If I were to invest in something like Wejo right now, I know about them. I think they're going to do well. But do I believe that Wejo is going to take over the world with connected vehicle data? No, not because I don't think they will, but because I have not gone as deep as I needed to go on an investment thesis for me to be able to come to that conclusion. Now, some people may be like, you're thinking about it too much, right? If you know these core tenets, that's all you need, that you're able to make the decision. That's fine, but for me, I try to have positions that are at least $10,000, right? Or at least that's what I'm trying to do. So if I'm going to put $10,000 into a company, that's not a small amount of money, at least for me. And I think for most people, that's not a small amount of money. So at that point, if I'm not ready to sleep well at night, knowing that that company could lose a lot of money, I could be down 80-70% for a couple of years, and hold out, then I'm just going to panic sell, right? If I don't have enough conviction on that company, I would have panic sold on Palantir if I really didn't understand the value that I think Palantir has. So for me, I will only invest in the SPAC investments if one day I decide to dedicate the time, which will probably take a couple months, to go super deep on what is the business model, what is the growth trajectory, what are the plans for a Black Sky or for a Wejo or for any of the other SPAC investments. Because I'm not willing to do that, and because I really don't think those companies have the same potential that a company that's invested in those companies has, then I think it makes all the sense in the world to get exposure to those companies through this risky, basically index ETF that I'm investing in, and get all the upside of what I think Palantir's growth potential is able to have. It's basically like, do you want to invest in an app, or do you want to invest in an app store, the way I think of Palantir? Now, all these SPAC investments are app stores in and of themselves, but they're all building their apps on top of Palantir Foundry. They're all building their core software offerings on top of Foundry. They're all using Foundry to power all of their decisions. So at that point, it's just a no-brainer to me to invest in the thing that's powering all the other things, get some exposure to those things. If those things do great, awesome. But I think Palantir is one of those stocks that, to me, again, not trying to speak in hyperbole, but for me feels like holding a little bit of like the next Tesla. I don't feel like that's the same thing with Wejo or a Black Sky. right? So whenever I get this question, I'm like, look, if you're ready to do the due diligence and understand this company and really feel that, at $4, this thing is an absolute steal because it could be $50 one day, then that's great. You've got to take the time to do that due diligence, do that analysis, then make that decision. If you're not ready to do all of that analysis, so for the S&P 500, you're not ready to analyze 500 companies, then you invest in an index of those 500 companies. Invest in Palantir, in my opinion, this is what I would do. That's an index of these 14 SPACs, get limited exposure to them, which means you have limited upside, but you also have limited downside, but you have the massive upside of Palantir actually playing out, just like you have the massive upside of the US economy never going to crap, which is why the S&P 500 is probably going to deliver some type of return that's reasonable over the next 5-6 years. So those are my thoughts on investing in Palantir versus investing in their SPAC investments. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what you guys think. Do you guys want to invest in the SPACs? Do you guys not want to invest in the SPACs? Or do you guys want to just rather put your money into Palantir because you get exposure to the SPACs through Palantir? Thank you guys for watching. My name is Mitt. I'll see you in the next one.